It's sometime in early 1932. You're in a farmhouse on the western coast of the Isle of Man, 725 feet above sea level, on a windswept stretch of hillside so remote and so far from anything resembling civilization that the nearest actual town might as well be on a different planet. And it's night, and the wind outside is doing what the wind always does on this particular island. It's howling. It's pressing itself against the stone walls like it's trying to get in. And the three people inside this house, a man, his wife, and their 13-year-old daughter, are not paying attention to the wind because the wind is the least of their problems right now. They're moving a bed. Specifically, they're trying to move their daughter's bed out of her room and into the parents' room, dragging the wooden frame across the floorboards because for the last week, something has been making their lives absolutely miserable. Something that lives in the walls. Something that has been scratching, whispering, throwing stones, making threats, and generally behaving like the world's worst houseguest. And that something does not want the bed moved. Because as the bed frame scrapes against the floor, a sound erupts from inside the wooden wall panels. A voice, high-pitched and shrill. Someone once said it was 1 or 2 full octaves above what a human throat could naturally produce. And it is, by all accounts, trembling with rage. "I'll follow her," the voice shrieks, "wherever you move her." The three of them freeze. The family retreats. They barricade themselves in the main bedroom. Dressing boxes, chairs, heavy weights pushed against the door. And then they watch. They watch as the top of the door begins to bulge inward. Not shake, not rattle, bulge. Like something on the other side is pushing against the wood with focused, concentrated force. And then the voice again, calm now, which is somehow worse. "I'm coming in." Before any of them can do anything, there's a crash. A heavy pot of ointment that had been sitting on a shelf inside the locked room is suddenly airborne. It travels across the room by itself and slams into the bedstand with enough force to leave a mark. The father challenges the voice. He demands to know what it is. And the response he gets is one of the strangest things ever reportedly spoken in the English language. "I am a freak," the voice says, from right on the other side of the door. "I have hands and I have feet, and if you saw me, you'd faint. You'd be petrified, mummified, turned into stone or a pillar of salt." The door holds. Eventually the night goes quiet. But the thing in the walls does not leave. It never leaves. Welcome back to Paranormal Directive 13. I am your host, Matt, and tonight we're going to the Isle of Man in the 1930s, where a farming family claimed that something was living in their house, something that could speak, something that claimed to be 80 years old, born in India, and capable of splitting the atom. Something that called itself Jeff. And before we're done, you are going to seriously question whether the most rational explanation for this story is the supernatural one. This is the story of Jeff the Mongoose. Now let's start with the geography because it matters a little more than you might think. The Isle of Man sits in the Irish Sea, roughly equidistant between England, Scotland, and Ireland and Wales, belonging technically to none of them. It operates under its own parliament, the Tynwald, one of the oldest continuously operating parliaments in the world. It has its own culture, its own folklore, its own language, and crucially, its own version of reality, which sometimes bumps up against the mainland version in ways that are a little difficult to reconcile. And then there's the western coast of the island, specifically a farm called Dorlish Cashin, or Cashin's Gap. In 1917, a man named James Irving moved his wife Margaret and his young daughter Vorey to this farm, 725 feet above sea level on a barren, windswept down. Jim, as he was known, was a former piano tuner from Liverpool. He was educated, curious, a man who liked to read the newspapers and keep himself informed about the world. Now, the First World War had wrecked the economy and upended his previous life. And somehow he'd wound up here trying to make a go of it as a sheep farmer. So let's just say that is a bit of a significant career pivot. The farmhouse itself was a stone structure with wooden interior paneling, and there is a large gap between that stone and the paneling. 700 feet above sea level means you're almost always in some degree of wind. The nearest town of any real size was Peel. It was accessible by a winding road that a bus traveled irregularly. Their nearest neighbors were a significant distance away. Jim, Margaret, and their daughter Vori lived here in the stone box on a hill with their sheepdog Mona, their sheep, and the wind. And that's it. That is the whole cast until September of 1931. Vori was 13 at the start of this story. She was described by everyone knew her as shy, intelligent, and uncomfortable around other kids her age. She liked animals and preferred roaming the hills alone rather than socializing in the village. Her schoolmates, charming as children always are, had nicknamed her the Spook, not because of anything supernatural, just because she was odd and kept to herself. Vori Irving was, by all accounts, a lonely kid on a lonely hill in a lonely house. And in September of 1931, something moved in. Now, it started the way a lot of things start, so mundanely that you'd almost miss it. There was scratching sounds coming from behind the wooden wall panels. Now, Jim Irving, man of practicality, did the reasonable thing. He assumed it was a rat, or a weasel, or a ferret. The countryside is full of small things that scratch and rustle, and a farmhouse with a gap between the stone and the wood is basically a luxury hotel for rodents. And he set about trying to trap whatever it was. But the scratching didn't stop, and it also didn't quite sound right. It was too varied, for one thing, too rhythmic in ways that didn't match how an animal typically moves. It came from different parts of the walls at different times, as if whatever was in there was moving deliberately, almost purposefully, through the passages. And then the sound changed, and this is where it gets interesting. By October 1931, roughly a month in, the sounds behind the panels were no longer just scratching, they were mimicry. The creature, whatever it was, had started imitating the sounds of the family's sheepdog, Mona. Not approximately, but accurately enough that the Irvings could tell which sounds were Mona and which were not Mona. It could bark, it could whimper, it could make the little half-howl sound Mona made when she wanted attention. And then it started in on the cats in the neighborhood, and then the nursery rhymes. So let me say that again. The thing in the walls, which Jim Irving still believed might be some kind of large ferret, began repeating nursery rhymes. Specifically, nursery rhymes that Vori had been reciting in her room. The creature had apparently been listening, and now it was playing them back. And Jim, to his credit, did not pack up and leave. Instead, and this tells you everything you need to know about the man, he started to talk to it. He would sit near the wall panels and recite things. Animal sounds, simple phrases, words in different languages. He treated it like a particularly unusual scientific experiment, and the creature behind the wall responded. If Jim made a sound, the thing would mimic it. If he spoke slowly and clearly, the thing would try to repeat what he'd said. And over the course of just a few weeks, the mimicry became something else entirely. It became language. Now, the transition from animal sounds to actual speech apparently happened gradually and then all at once, the way most inexplicable things tend to do. The entity first accepted the name Jack, presumably because Jack is a common name for domestic spirits in Manx folklore, and Jim was a kind of educated, curious man who might have suggested it. But then the entity pushed back. It didn't want to be Jack. It spelled out its preferred name phonetically, one letter at a time. G-E-F. Jeff. Now specifically, not Jeff, J-E-F-F, or Jeff, G-E-O-F-F, or any other variation, but G-E-F. and it was very, very particular about this. In the way that someone is particular about the pronunciation of their name when people keep getting it wrong. And then, once the name situation was sorted, Jeff started talking. Properly, fluently, in full sentences, in English, in a voice described as being 1 or 2 octaves higher than any human voice should naturally be able to go. The voice was clear, articulate, and this is one of the details that tends to derail rational thinking about this case. Possessed of a distinct personality from the very first moment it arrived at full linguistic capability. Jeff was rude. Jeff was an asshole. He was sarcastic. He had opinions, and strong ones, frequently unflattering. He called James a flat-headed gnome when Jim was too slow to turn the newspaper page while reading aloud. He made cutting remarks about visitors. He was mischievous in the way that a 10-year-old who had discovered they can be anonymous online is mischievous, which is to say, gleefully with zero accountability. He was, in his own way, charming. He told jokes, he sang hymns, he sang Home on the Range, which apparently was a particular favorite of his. He gossiped, he complained. He had, in other words, the complete emotional range of a person who had been cooped up for too long and has found an audience. And then there were the claims. Jeff told the Irving family that he had been born in New Delhi, India on June 7, 1852. This would make him, at the time of the haunting, or whatever you want to call it, approximately 80 years old. A significant stretch for an animal whose average lifespan is about 20 years. But Jeff was not particularly bothered by such objections. He described having seen the pyramids and the Sphinx rising up from the sand. He claimed to have traveled extensively. He seemed to regard the farmhouse at Cashin's Gap not as his final destination, but as more like a rest stop on a longer journey. He also described himself in a variety of ways that didn't quite fit together. He described himself as a mongoose, a weasel ghost, an earthbound spirit, an extra clever mongoose. At his most grandiose, and Jeff had his grandiose moments, he proclaimed, "I'll split the atom. I am the 5th dimension. I am the 8th wonder of the world." Now, this is 1932. The splitting of the atom was very much in the public scientific conversation. Jim read the newspapers aloud, and Jeff was apparently paying attention. Now, here's the thing that's pretty strange about the Jeff case, and there's many strange things, but after the initial period of terror and confrontation, the Irving family essentially adapted. Jeff became a house guest, a permanent, invisible, deeply annoying house guest who knew too much, never paid rent, but a house guest nonetheless. He took up residence in what he called his sanctum, which was a small alcove in the rafters, located directly above Voorhees' bedroom. He moved through the walls, disappearing and reappearing at will. He could apparently access any room in the house, could hear conversations happening in rooms he wasn't visible in, and frequently proved his omniscience by accurately describing what family members had been doing when they thought they were alone. This is the surveillance aspect of the case, and it's one of the more psychologically interesting elements. Jeff did not merely exist in the house. He watched. He claimed he could see and hear everything, and his ability to accurately describe events he shouldn't have been able to witness seemed to corroborate this claim in ways the family found difficult to dismiss. His relationship with the family was complex in ways that went well beyond talking animal. With Jim Irving, Jeff was something like an intellectual sparring partner, if one of those partners was frequently insulting and occasionally threw things. Jim would read the newspaper aloud to the house, and Jeff would comment, argue, ask follow-up questions. He called Jim Jimmo sometimes. There was affection in the dynamic, however twisted alongside the contempt that he had. With Voorhees, Jeff's relationship was the most intimate, and from a psychological analysis standpoint, the most loaded. He lived above her room. He seemed most active when she was home. He interacted with her more directly than with either parent. He described her as special. Whether this was protective, possessive, or something weirder than either of those things is a question that different investigators have answered very differently. With Margaret, the relationship was more domestic. Margaret reportedly touched Jeff's teeth through a crack in the paneling at one point. She felt small, sharp teeth, she said. Jeff also had practical contributions to the household. He hunted rabbits. Now, this is one of the more surreal details in a story that already has a very high surrealism threshold. Jeff claimed to hunt rabbits on the hillside and would leave them for the family, killed and ready to be used. The Irvings, who were not exactly flush with cash, apparently sold some of these rabbits and used others for food. The Dalby spook was, among other things, a source of supplemental income. He also served as a one Mongoose intelligence operation. Jeff claimed, and this is where it gets into territory that made neighbors distinctly uncomfortable, to ride on the roofs of buses into the town of Peel, where he would listen to the conversations of drivers and locals, then bring the gossip back to the farmhouse. And the Irvings' knowledge of local affairs became, over time, uncannily accurate. They seemed to know things about their neighbors' private lives that they had no obvious way of knowing. Things like the layout of a bus driver's flat on the first floor of a building Vorey had never visited, details of recent purchases, overheard conversations that people were very sure had been private. Locals started calling him the Dalby Spook. They also named him the Man Weasel. Neither name was meant as a compliment. But let's not romanticize this too much, because Jeff was not, by any measure, a benign presence. He threatened to kill the family's poultry if they disrespected him. He threw objects, including that pot of ointment that we talked about in the cold open. He hurled stones at people he didn't like. He made specific, colorful threats. At one point, he reportedly said, "I'll blow your brains out with a 3-penny cartridge," which is a threat that is somehow both extremely specific and completely unhinged. The night of the bulging door was not an isolated incident. There was a pattern of escalation when Jeff felt challenged or ignored. He would move from verbal provocation to physical manifestation, sounds becoming voices, becoming thrown objects, becoming the visible deformation of physical structures. James Irving documented all of this obsessively in over 200 pages of diaries and letters. And this is another feature of the case that distinguishes it from most haunting stories. The primary source material is extraordinary in its volume and detail. Jim was not a passive witness. He was a chronicler. He was driven by the conviction, which seemed to deepen rather than diminish over time, that he was in the presence of something genuinely unprecedented. He called Jeff the eighth wonder of the world, not sarcastically. At some point in the early years of the haunting, a man named Arthur Morrison came to stay at Dorlish Cashin. Morrison was a friend of the family, the son of a wealthy Liverpool businessman. He was also, by his own account, a skeptic. He came to the farmhouse specifically because he wanted to observe the situation and expose whatever hoax or delusion was at work. He was, in the vocabulary of the paranormal, a debunker. Jeff did not like Arthur Morrison. The moment Morrison arrived, Jeff made this clear. From somewhere inside the walls, his voice emerged. "Hello, call me Jeff. I am an earthbound spirit." Just right out of the gate. Not hello or welcome, just here's my name, here's my metaphysical category, now let's get this over with. During the night, Morrison was awakened by a disturbance beneath his bed. He leaned over and looked into the darkness under the frame, and claimed he saw a pair of yellow eyes looking back at him, which, that alone sounds genuinely terrifying. Then, Jeff spat at him, and then, and again, I want to make sure this lands with its full surreal weight, Jeff issued a stern warning. Now do you believe? Don't you dare upset Jimmo with any skeptical remarks. The next morning, Morrison was greeted with, "Get up, you lazy blighter." Morrison was shaken but not yet convinced, which, okay, how are you not convinced? He was skeptical enough that he was still looking for rational explanations. And then something happened. He was inside the house when he heard a terrible screech. the kind of sound that stops your heart, coming from directly behind him. He spun around and there was nothing there. So he looked out the window. Vorey was outside in the field tending sheep, nearly 100 yards away. Clearly visible, clearly not in a position to have produced the sound directly behind his head inside the house. Morrison left. He never published an account of what he witnessed, and he didn't come back. But by all reports, his skepticism had taken a fairly significant hit. He had no explanation for what he'd heard. This is why the Arthur Morrison incident tends to loom large in discussions of the case, because Morrison wasn't a family member. He had no investment in Jeff being real. He came to disprove the whole thing, and he left unresolved. Now, there's another incident from early 1932 that tends to get somewhat lost in the coverage of Jeff, probably because it's just so weird that people don't quite know what to do with it. Jim Irving was out on the hillside near the farm when he spotted an animal in the field that he couldn't immediately identify. He later described it as a very large cat striped like a tiger. Not a domestic cat, not any breed he recognized, something that didn't belong on this particular island on a regular Tuesday in the early 1930s. Jim got his shotgun, he pursued the animal. He watched it turn a corner near a sod hedge, which is a low earthen wall, and followed after it just a few seconds later. The field was flat and completely empty. There was no bush large enough to hide a cat, no depression, no hole, no tunnel. The animal had simply ceased to exist between one corner and the next. Jim came back inside and told Margaret what he'd seen, and from within the walls, Jeff's voice emerged, entirely casual, entirely unbothered. "It was me you saw, Jim. Shape-shifting." Now, for what it's worth, the Isle of Man has a rich tradition of supernatural entities that shift form. The Fenadri is one, which is a kind of hairy spirit from Manx folklore, capable of great physical feats and physical transformations. Whether you want to locate Jeff within that tradition or treat this as an unrelated claim, the shape-shifting incident doesn't fit neatly into the talented adolescent ventriloquist theory that most skeptics fall back on. 13-year-old girls are not typically in the business of faking large striped cats in open fields. By 1935, the Dalby spook had become a genuine media phenomenon. British newspapers had picked it up, international papers were running items, the farmhouse at Cashin's Gap was receiving sightseers, and the world's leading psychical researchers were making the journey to the Isle of Man. Two men defined the investigative phase of this case. They approached it from opposite directions and came away with opposite conclusions, and neither of them, ultimately, could prove their theory. The first was Harry Price. Harry Price was, by this point in his career, the most famous ghost hunter in Britain. He had founded the National Laboratory of Psychical Research. He had investigated the Borley Rectory case, which was considered the most haunted house in England. He was known for his rigorous, forensic, skeptical approach. He arrived at Cashin's Gap in 1935 with Richard S. Lambert, a journalist, and he came prepared to document everything. Price immediately zeroed in on the architecture, the double walls, the gap between stone and wood, the way sounds could travel through those spaces and emerge seemingly from nowhere. He described it as a great speaking tube that could project and amplify sounds through every room. This, he believed, was the physical mechanism. Someone producing a voice in one location could have it emerge from any wall in the house, making it impossible to localize. And he collected physical evidence. Hair samples, supposedly plucked from Jeff's own back and handed over through the walls, were sent to the Zoological Society for analysis. F. Martin Duncan examined the specimens. His conclusion: not a mongoose. Not any animal that should be living inside a farmhouse wall. In fact, it was absolutely identical to hair from a long-haired dog. Specifically, when Price sent Duncan a control sample, hair from Mona, the family's sheepdog, the expert could not distinguish it from the alleged Jeff hair. The paw prints were worse. Plaster casts had been made of Jeff's supposed tracks. The front paws measured 8 to 10 centimeters, an anatomical impossibility for a 30-centimeter long mongoose. The skin texture was wrong, and the tooth marks in the modeling clay that Jeff had supposedly made were identified as consistent with those of a small human child. Price concluded it was a hoax, a psychological fraud. He believed the family was caught in some combination of deliberate deception and genuine shared delusion, though he carefully avoided making specific legal accusations. He did not believe in Jeff. And then there was Nandor Fodor. Now, Nandor Fodor was a Hungarian-American parapsychologist and psychoanalyst, a man who operated at the intersection of the supernatural and the psychological. He arrived at the farmhouse in 1937, and he was asking different questions than Price had been. Fodor wasn't particularly interested in whether the hair was dog hair. He was interested in why this was happening. What psychological need did Jeff serve? What function did he fill in the emotional landscape of this isolated family? His investigation was hampered in a somewhat poetic way by Jeff himself. The entity refused to speak during Fodor's stay. He left him biscuits and chocolate as peace offerings, and he got silence. And this infuriated Fodor, but also fascinated him because it suggested, if nothing else, that Jeff had agency. He could choose not to perform. Before he left, Fodor wrote Jeff a thank you note, acknowledging him as a very good and generous mongoose, and expressing appreciation for the visit. Privately, he was already revising his theory in a significant direction. His eventual conclusion was that Jeff was not a physical entity, not a fraud in the crude sense that Price had implied, but rather a psychological projection, specifically a kind of externalized alter ego, most likely an expression of James Irving's unconscious mind. A man who had been educated, ambitious, and socially engaged and was now trapped on a remote farm with failing finances and diminishing prospects had somehow created a vehicle for all the things he could no longer be. Witty, provocative, free to travel, impossible to corner. Jeff was, in Fodor's reading, Jim Irving's adventure self. The version of him that could ride on bus roofs and insult visitors and claim to have seen the pyramids. So let's actually think about this, because there are really only a handful of explanations for what happened at Dorlish Cashin, and none of them are entirely comfortable. The first theory is that Vorey did it. This is the mainstream skeptical position. Vorey was 13 at the start, the precise age most frequently associated with poltergeist activity in the psychical research literature. She was intelligent, isolated, creative, and living in a house with unique acoustic properties. The wooden paneling created a speaking tube effect that allowed sounds produced in one location to emerge from seemingly anywhere. The argument goes Vorey taught herself ventriloquism. She used the walls, she exploited the acoustics, and over time, the fabrication grew beyond anything she initially intended, and she was trapped by it. First by her father's obsessive enthusiasm, and then by the media attention. Now, this theory has some real force. Vorey was the only family member who claimed to regularly see Jeff in physical form. She provided the only photographs, which were uniformly blurry and inconclusive, often looking more like a cat or a squirrel than a mongoose. And her dietary preferences allegedly matched Jeff's stated preferences: bacon with no fat and chocolates. But the theory has problems. The Arthur Morrison incident. Where is Vorey in that story? She's in a field 100 yards away tending sheep. She's visible. And the sound is inside the house, directly behind a grown man. The multilingual elements. Jeff reportedly produced fragments of Russian, Hebrew, and Spanish. Vorey was a shy, isolated 13-year-old on a remote farm with extremely limited access to education or language resources. Where did she learn enough of 3 separate foreign languages to produce convincing fragments on demand? And then there's also Vorey's own testimony. In 1970, 25 years after her father's death, a researcher tracked down Vorey Irving, now an adult, living in Cheltenham, away from the Isle of Man. She had built a quiet life, and she clearly didn't want to discuss any of this. When pressed, she said, "It was not a hoax, and I wish it had never happened." She said Jeff had kept her from getting married, had ruined her social standing in her community. had followed her through her adult life as a shadow she couldn't shake. She expressed anger at her father for how excited he'd been about Jeff, for telling anyone who would listen. If Vorey had fabricated Jeff, if she had spent years playing an increasingly elaborate game that consumed her family and destroyed her social life, what would be the point of maintaining the lie in 1970? She had nothing to gain. She was not selling books or seeking publicity. She was, if anything, desperately wishing the whole thing would go away. And she maintained her account until her death in 2005. The second theory is the shared delusion, and this is Fodor's position more or less. The family's isolation was real and profound. Their social standing had declined. Jim was a smart, restless man doing work far beneath his intellectual capacity, and Vorey was chronically lonely, and Margaret was trapped. In this theory, the family collectively generated Jeff, not necessarily through conscious fabrication, but through a kind of shared psychological need. The entity became real to them in the way that things become real when a group of people agree, consciously or not, to treat them as real. This theory has the advantage of being non-supernatural. It doesn't require wires or hidden speakers. It doesn't require us to dismiss the family as liars. It acknowledges the genuine suffering involved. What it struggles with is the witnesses. Arthur Morrison, Captain Dennis, other local observers. These people did not share the Irving's isolation or their psychological needs. They had no reason to hallucinate a voice, and some of them came away from Dorish Cashin with experiences they couldn't explain. The third theory is something else. Now, I'm not going to tell you there was a talking mongoose living in the walls, but there is a version of the story in which the straightforward explanations, hoax, delusion, etc., don't quite account for everything, in which the architectural speaking tube is a real phenomenon that was really exploited, but not necessarily by Vorey, in which the psychological projections are real, but something external was also interacting with the family, in which the island's own tradition of entities that live at the boundary of things, human, animal, spirit, is more than just a metaphor. Manx folklore has always described beings that exist in the gaps, in the spaces, between the stone and the wood. And the house at Dorish Cashin was, architecturally, almost entirely gaps. What makes the Jeff case genuinely difficult to resolve as opposed to just strange, most hoaxes get confessed eventually. The people involved get old or sick or financially desperate or just tired. They want the record corrected. They write a memoir. They give a deathbed interview. Nobody confessed. James Irving maintained until his death in 1945 that Jeff was real. He maintained it with 200 pages of meticulous documentation. He maintained it with the conviction of a man who believed he had witnessed the eighth wonder of the world. Vorey Irving maintained, right up until her death in 2005 at the age of 87, that it was not a hoax, that she wished it had never happened, that it had damaged her life in ways she never fully recovered from. And Margaret Irving never publicly contradicted the family's account. The physical evidence was largely debunked, but the testimony was not. And testimony from outside the family, from witnesses with no stake in the story, was never adequately explained away. When the farmhouse was eventually demolished, no hidden wires were found, no speaker systems, no secret passages, no elaborate mechanism through which a 13-year-old might have conducted the most complex and sustained paranormal hoax in British recorded history. Just the stone walls and the gaps between them. Jeff's activity diminished as Vorey grew into adulthood. By the late 1930s, the high-pitched voice in the walls had become less frequent, and by the early 1940s, it was barely present. After James Irving died in 1945, Margaret sold the farm and left. The man who bought it, his name was Leslie Graham, claimed that shortly after moving in, he shot and killed an unusual animal on the property. It was large, he said, weasel-like, but not quite matching any local species. He had it photographed. And when the photograph was shown to Vorey Irving, she was direct. That's not Jeff. She didn't claim nothing had been shot. She just said it wasn't him. The implication, if you're willing to follow it out to the edge of that, is that Jeff had been there somewhere, had not been shot, and he had simply left. That whatever had been living in those walls had eventually moved on, the way a lodger moves on when the house no longer serves its purpose. Vore spent the rest of her long life trying to live quietly away from her own history. She never sought money from the story, never sought attention. If anything, she actively avoided both. When she died in 2005, she had spent 60 years wishing the whole thing would just go away. So what do we make of Jeff? A researcher once described the case as irreducibly mysterious. And that's a pretty honest thing you can say about it. The skeptical explanations don't quite close the loop. The supernatural explanations require you to accept things that are, at best, genuinely insane. And the psychological explanation has real merit but leaves certain witnesses unaccounted for. What remains is a story about a family on a hillside, isolated and struggling, maybe desperate for something to break the monotony and the loneliness. And something, whether you call it a projection, a poltergeist, a clever mongoose, or an entity from some category we don't have a word for, responded. It watched, it gossiped, it sang Home on the Range. It called a man a fat-headed gnome for turning newspaper pages too slowly. It threatened to turn people into pillars of salt. It left rabbits on the doorstep and rode buses and claimed to have seen the pyramids rising out of the sand. And then it said, at one point or another, the truest thing it had ever said. If you knew what I know, you'd know a hell of a lot. We don't know what Jeff knew. We don't know what Jeff was. We just know the door bulged inward. The pot flew across the room, and the voice said, I'm coming in. And then it was in 40 years, in the gaps between the walls of a stone farmhouse on a hill above the Irish Sea. And wherever it went when it finally left, it never told anyone. Maybe Jeff is still out there, riding on the roof buses, watching, knowing things it shouldn't, just waiting for someone to sit close enough to a wall and listen. Thank you guys so much for listening to episode number 52, the Jeff the Mongoose story. I wanted to kind of mix things up. The past couple weeks have been long and lengthy and in-depth and really kind of, I don't really know the word I want to use, more just deep stories. The Voynich, the Allagash 4, very alien heavy, things like that. So I want to do something a little more lighthearted, a little more fun, and Jeff the Mongoose fit that bill perfectly. When I first heard the story, it was one of those ones that's like, is it a cryptid? Is it a ghost? Is it interdimensional? Is it a hoax? And none of them really add up. There is a picture that I've seen of the family and apparently Jeff sitting on a fence post. And again, it's the 1930s and the cameras aren't that great. And it just looks like a fuzzy animal, like a furry cat or something sitting on the fence next to them. But they claim it's Jeff. And no one's really been able to say one way or the other. There's theories out there that, the dog hair and things like that were supposedly from Jeff, but proven to be part of the hair from their dog was actually Jeff playing a prank, which based on his personality would make sense. But it's just, none of it lines up. I was saying in the end, nothing really accounts for everything. And it's one of those stories that you just have to kind of pick a lane and kind of roll with that's what you think it is. I like to believe that Jeff was a real talking mongoose who lived in the walls of a farmhouse on the Isle of Man. It makes the world more fun for me. And my wife even asked me while I was recording this, if Jeff was in the walls of my house, would I let him stay or would I be annoyed and kick him out? And I told her that I think I would let him stay. As annoying as he would be, I think it would just make things a little more fun to have a mongoose running around and talking shit to everybody. I don't know. That just sounds fun to me. Anyways, if you guys like the episode, please go on whatever podcast app you use, whether that's Apple or Spotify or iHeart or Amazon or any number of the podcast apps out there. Leave a rating, leave a review, share the show, and let's tell more people about Jeff the Mongoose. Also, check out the social medias, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, all at Paranormal Directive 13. And check out the Patreon, patreon.com/Paranormal Directive 13, where for just $3 a month, you can get access to ad-free episodes. For $5 a month, you can get access to ad-free episodes and also get a shout-out on the show. And for $7 a month, you can get everything included in the other one. And then you can also be a member of the Mantis Research Fund, where we are going to figure out what the Mantis entities are up to. So check that out, patreon.com/Paranormal Directive 13. And remember, guys, if you hear scratching in your walls, it might just be a talking mongoose.